Welcome to the final critique video. You guys did fantastic work. Congratulations on seeing the entire class all the way through. I can see a ton of development and advancement in the overall look of the faces and the construction and form and perspective of your head. So that's a really exciting thing for me to be able to see. And I know it comes as a result of a lot of hard work on your guys' part. I think most of the ones that I see or that I'm going through and kind of choosing or selecting for the review, all are really well done, so it's hard for me in some cases to find things to make thematic to the critique overall. But let's just take a look at this one to start, and we'll kind of see if we can work through that and double check some of what's going on. I think for the most part, all of these look really good. Like when I looked at these, the planes of the big cranium and jaw feel good. Maybe we could push a little bit more of this neck, kind of given a little bit more of a direction that could exaggerate the diagonal movement of that. Could help the overall feeling of that. Step 2, right? So going back to those big principles, step 2 being the tilts, I think in our early workflow. But the rest of it's really nice, and that's a pretty minor thing. In other words, I guess when I look at these, I don't see a ton off with the features, if anything at all, right? It feels like these are well developed and they have a nice sense of an overall structure that supports the individual perspectives and features. This is just going to be our first review one where I'm going to go and just build it all up again so that we have this reinforcement of all of the different steps it took to get here. There's that cheek rhythm. We liked that. I think we could get maybe just a slight stronger canopy for our jaw. Even though we've addressed this in past critique videos, I think that's always a hard one to get. Still see people in some comments, trying to deal with this underplane. So if you are one of those, just a quick review here, and then you could go back and watch it in prior reviews to get a better sense of how I'm getting through that. So there's my underplane, and then proportions I think look good. So this is my brow, chin, halves, and that would be related to the bottom of the ear. Half for the sockets, eyes and keystone, thirds, chin. And then when I see the gray line in this, or your underdrawing, all of that socket area looks very convincing, well placed in terms of perspective. Get that nice keystone. This inside plane for the eye could be something to try to find a bit more. And once you find the kind of the mapped perspective form of the whole of the socket, prior to going into that individual shape for your eye, see if you can start working in or sculpting in some of these inside planes. Then for my nose, if I'm just playing out the big, bulky box form, I think the tip of the nose is there. You did a good job sighting that. All worked out nice. And then that's coming back here. So I really get underneath that, and that helps with that read of being beneath the head. There's my center. So I don't think in all of our crits today we'll be going through the whole like this, but again, it's just an opportunity to give a quick reminder as to all the work that went into making the feature itself look like it has a home. Sometimes if you feel like there's something off with your feature, I think 9 times out of 10, it's something big like this stuff, which is why I'll spend a good amount of time just shaping it or laying it in and getting comfortable before I'll start to devote too much attention to the individual perspectives and forms of the features themselves. So there's my underplane, and then my denture sphere, which I'm thinking about as that egg or sphere form that interacts in terms of some perspective with the area around the cheek, nose, and eye, and then chin. So this would be a place where I would then begin to feel more comfortable getting into specific areas or, forms of the features. And I like what you've done so far, right? I think that, the basic design of the eye looks pretty nice. Now, the next thing I would want to try to push would be, you have a great design. Can we go a step further and maybe try to find the same emphasis on perspective and form that we did in our big structure? So, for example, can we see the form of the eyelid? What is that? Maybe that's a really small perspective plane. For some, this could be, and everybody can make their own judgment about this now that you've been through the majority of the information in the lecture. Maybe that's overkill for you. Maybe it's too much to try to see, like, I get it, it's not for everybody. Like, all these smaller turns is a series of form and form change. This looks like it's the fat, like she's got a little fat on the top of the eyelid there that would be cresting and kind of moving around the top of the eye. Maybe that helps you explain like why we're seeing this amount of shadow, as we transition into making more light and shadow, considerate heads. Like, this is always that hard area with that softened temple. Maybe starting to look at some of those smaller form details. Or if this helps you explain that soft turn to the outside of the temple, or bring the other side of the eyelid around. And then on this one, I'm like, I think this is a nice line, that little C curve. I see what you're getting at there for the pinch of the tarsus against the fat. Maybe I'll try to do the same. Like, how would I understand that as a form? Maybe I go over the eye, out across the lid. This is the area too where I talked about and I understand if that's confusing, the ribbon of the eye. So this being, that this comes more so forward. This is the basic point of that pushes out and this tucks back. So I'm trying to think of a form that comes forward. If a ribbon is too oblique or bizarre, then think of it like a plane that's twisting instead. But the eyebrow is a plane that's just kind of folding like that. And so we have this part sticking out or pushing closer to the temple, and this part becoming more recessive. That's how I kind of think about the explanation of form for getting this pocket of lighting and that recess in there. So that, I think, could be something to think about to progress here. Like this one, I see the other ones too. You're kind of starting to do it around the nose and the lips, where you're adding some of those smaller planes here and there. Again, I don't think it's something like if any of you, and I imagine this is a good amount of you, might at this point be a little fatigued by structure. Right? So the more that I load structure onto you, I understand and I'm sympathetic to the fact that at this point you might be like, oh geez, enough. No, we just did all your structure, no more structure. And I think that's a healthy thing, a healthy response. Like for now, what you should do is, if you felt comfortable and like you got to a good place with this where you could understand and internalize some of it, maybe go see how you could apply it somewhere else. Take a painting class. See if you could use this information to understand how to paint a head better, or use the information regarding plane and the degree to which it turns to understand color better, temperature, anything like that. That's, I think, the point of knowing the structure. And then if you want to come back and revisit things to help along that journey, like getting more in depth into the planes around the eye or something like that, that's where I think this quality and type of study becomes useful. It's probably not best as just an end in and of itself, or then you end up like me and you're just teaching anatomy for 20 years and you're still getting excited about tiny little planes around the eyelid, which, is good for me, but everybody's got to find their own thing. Like here, what also is interesting is, what if we could start to see the fold of the cheek, the nasal area here, as a perspective, right? So maybe we think about this cheek as having plane changes. So that makes sense now to the lighting, right, where that light breaks. And maybe now I could understand, or if I internalize this, maybe I could invent the way that light crests on a young woman's cheek, with this kind of study. Or maybe I was like, I got to shave that nose down more, or what are the planes that are taking place around the nose? These would be suggestions for, like later areas. Or if we go into the mouth, I think the mouth here might be a little flat. So maybe I need to kind of raise my nose up a bit. Maybe we can push some more of that form relationship by thinking of the way some of this folds around the big shape. So we have, the gesture of the face as a smile. That's always tough. So maybe that's just about finding this arc. So we have that big, I want to get a consistent ellipse, around that denture sphere. There's also a slight pull up. What is this as a form? So that's getting really crazy. This was the plane change for the cheek and the nasal furrow. And then for the lips themselves, let's try to get that profile view where we talked about how they come out and back. So 1, 2 planes. I think something like that usually is helpful here, where we're thinking out, across, back, and in. So in the future, this kind of drawing I mostly am using when not teaching in instances where I really don't feel like I understand something. I don't understand something well enough to design it, invent it, or draw it in a way that I'm, comfortable in the experience. So this is almost like a pause, a meditation. Are you kind of getting in and trying to learn as much as you can about the subject you're seeing? So here's that lip turn. And then for that lower lip, I would try to maybe choose this line so that we're still moving across that denture sphere. I should be a little lower. Try to relate that lid across. And then let's push that back some. This would be the mouth. Have the connection for the lip over here. And then I could tell, so I'm going to now start reading some of the light and shadow as plain. The top part of that lip is in light, so that gets a little bit of light here and then turns back. So that would be the relationship of this to that. And then this is a little bit stretched across that area. And then now we're into that kind of drop back underneath the mouth and lip right above the chin. That would be emphasized, or a good thing to emphasize, to pull that smile more if we want to start focusing more on our expression. And then same thing, what does the light and shadow tell me about that chin? It tells me that there's a plane change here. And now we could maybe even think about what are the differences between male and female skull types and chin stereotypically. Women are a little bit softer, don't project quite as much there. And then if we just kind of work our way back up some of this jawline, look at this nice light and shadow line here. That would be, what is that, the masseter? That part of that chewing muscle pulling up. So you have a great finish to the overall lesson. I could see how everything here was really well internalized and understood and studied and practiced, and you ended up with some really nice heads all throughout the submission. This would just be a next step thing. If you ever return to this and feel like you could use more structure, I think you could probably emphasize the individual perspectives of the features even more in the way that I tried to kind of set them out here. But I think it's a great series of drawings and a nice submission. All right, so this next one is really nice also from the standpoint of having all the big stuff put together, right? So I think you could, in all of these, see the proportion is clean. The layout of the features has a nice relationship in terms of the planar structure and quality to the underlying forms. But I still see, not to harp on it, but if we went through our checklist, I could still see a slight variation in tilt, right? From our reference maybe to the image, drawn image. It's really minimal, but maybe this much more of a tilt to the head or the profile of the face contributes to an understanding of the subject in a way that details to the features wouldn't. So I don't think this takes away from anything that's done here at all. I still think this is the remainder of the drawings here. It could tell that put a lot of work and effort into understanding all the steps, and that all the steps are really clear and present in the way that the features continue to build up. Then when you get to the end, you have a new appreciation for the beginning in terms of what those early steps that seemed really vague or like, why are we doing this? You could see an appreciation for the impact on the final. Let's say we have an eye or a nose or anything. The placement and the look of the feature is nice. It's a good indication. What we'd want to do next is the same thing that we talked about in that initial submission, which is also finding planes, but you could do it in a way that doesn't have to be overbearing. So maybe instead of stopping the line here, I would just hook it and swing it out and around a bit more. And then, so it's kind of like that, like a hook shape or an S curve. And then what I'm trying to show you in this one would be the underplane of the eyelid. And we may not see it, when we get into those smaller areas. I think we could see it as a value, that there's a lightness and a darkness here, but that's just back to that area of the upper lid, kind of wrapping that S curve around it. And then we discussed how the different types of fat can fall in effect to give different feels for eye. So maybe there's a softer form above, and then same thing under. So if we start to pull this out and around, maybe I always want to bring it just slightly past so that it doesn't end up creating that tangent. I can assume with that overlap that that's going back and around to the other side. And really, this would be the easiest way to practice. This would just be, you're just wrapping boxes around a ball. Then maybe I cheat and really push this to have a top and then a bottom plane to it. That's the only part that kind of feels like it might be missing a little bit to me. So, and I know you mentioned that you had, or you had a little note that eyes were a big area of difficulty. So that would be my fix for all of them. But if we just went through all these and looked at the eyes, there's too much of an outline, and we could get more of that under, like even in this one. And then I want to go back to that profile. So if this is where I think the center of that eye is, use that as a reference point, wrap your lid around, and then where it, you know, crests or peaks and then drops back down, bring it back. And then here's the underplane. So I'm seeing that, and then maybe it tucks and goes behind in this like heavily raised eye. Here's the kind of the ball of the eye pushing forward, and then do the same thing with the lower lip. So as far as a workflow, this might help just because it forces you to maintain the form of the eye and then deliver the lid around it, instead of what ends up happening here where you have a nice form of the eye and then these almost, I mean, I think what we could do here is think of that value as a plane, but sometimes if I'm not comfortable seeing or thinking of that as a surface, because I could read it that way, doing this as an exercise helps me make it very literal or very practical. So that's all that I did here, just from a different angle. I'm wrapping, again, we're wrapping what would be a really narrowed box and then attaching it over a ball. So that when I get really confused about what needs to happen in my drawing, I always try to bring it back to like the base or bare mechanics that I'm trying to. An eye is just this plus this. It's 1 plus 2. And so I'm practicing doing that as eye studies on multiple, you know, different images or examples. And so then maybe we try to do the same thing here. What is the rectangle or the twisty box doing around this ball? Where I'm seeing the top of it, it's connecting in here, comes out. Here's the relationship to it, back down. So that'd be a kind of advice for eyes. The rest of this, so normally in profile, I see a lot of triangle. So I like how this works. I think you could probably exaggerate that even more and then bring this, like really let us see this underplane and then use that as a surface. The subsequent perspective forms of this feature going to sit inside of, right? So the idea in that is for the feature of the nose that we want to set this plane up really just so we can build and sculpt into it or take away from it. So here's, let's say, the depth of the nostril comes out around and then back up. And then I'm carving out what would be the hole. And then on the other side is the cartilage of the septum. So now that comes in, back down, and then out again. So I'm removing. I just want enough of a understanding of a feature or quality of it so that I can start to make changes or modifications to it, really. That's all that I've done here too. This for the lips is fantastic in terms of the approach, just like the eye and the nose as well. I think what would benefit us here though is taking this out. So see how that, if I'm trying to create the illusion for you that there is a form here, this is the worst possible line that I could use because it just flattens it. Everything else looks fantastic, but if we were to do maybe like the exact same drawing of your lips and then anything, a slight or a subtle curve, even if it's cheating, you know, like even if it's perfectly straight on without any wrap bend at all, I would still do something like that just so we swing it across and involve, you know, the viewer's attention in something that's more form-based. And then if I can see that, then I'll start to take that and just kind of echo it. Maybe I'm going to be under this area. And then I want to do the same thing. If I'm under the lip, I'm under the nose, I'm under the little divot in between the lips and the chin, then I'm going to like push that here too. But you under that. So that's the last thing I think that could happen to these. You're getting to a really good place that looks like it's just after the construction of the head and just prior to kind of the more organic feel of the features. This is where I think you could put a little bit more work in developing the big, kind of how we start to investigate the features and big ideas for their planes. You're like right on the bridge, like the cusp of it. Again, last thought here would be same thing. Remember, as you're thinking of this as the block, the next step would be, how am I modifying it by adding or subtracting form. So I'm going to wrap and kind of mold an egg around this. And then when I'm done with that, I want to, what did I do? Changing this into that. So you're gradually turning it. We started with a broad idea so that we could easily assess and place that perspective. And now we're just trying to customize it with smaller form modifications. So now this nostril that has a bottom plane, and then it tucks up and then in, and then this has a dimension. And again, just like I mentioned in the last critique, this can feel like overkill. So if your mind is just like, then don't worry about it. You could also get these same effects with light and shadow, right? Or painting. You're going to be able to pop these forms a little bit more by keeping these principles in mind, even if you don't feel the need to kind of really go deep with the perspective, plane, line treatment. So hope that helps, but otherwise I think you've done a really nice job working through all the content. So I think what we'd have here is another good effort or attempt at the features, but this one I think is worth including because we can all find ourselves in the same spot where we might be doing a really nice workup of the features, but the features and their look get held back a little bit by the early steps. But the one thing here that might be worth pointing out more instead of developing up the construction and planes would be just double checking not tilt or setup, but maybe proportion. So reproportioned, maybe that nose looks better or a little bit less elongated. Maybe with a double check to the halves early on here, we get a better placement or height for those eyes. So here would be just to double check this review are halves and thirds, got the side plane in there. Now you might even find that at some point you do shortcuts so that you don't have to do all of this and that you can start consolidating some steps or jumping around a bit and maybe even skipping steps that you just don't really need. But I always come back to it when I feel like I'm a little bit lost or I haven't quite gotten the result that I want at the end after I take a look at my drawing. So I like the way that the eyes are starting to develop. Some of what we just spoke about in our prior critique about wrapping that rectangle around the ball seems to be starting out pretty strongly. But what needs to happen a little bit more is just the way that the eyes are giving context, right? What's most important is that the eyes need a place to live. After that, once they have a place to live and they're kind of housed inside of that socket, then we could start to develop that secondary type of structure, which would be the eyelid. So again, here what would help is, let's double check when I do think about that wing of the nose or nostril, that gives me the corner of the eye. So that's going to help to maybe space the features a bit. So that scoots our feature or eyeball that way. And so now we kind of pull those apart a bit to give a little bit more breathing room. Maybe even getting in here and thinking about that keystone more, trying to sculpt into that could be useful. Big issue is just, if I do the exact same kind of thing you did for the nose here, right, but pull it up to that halfway point instead, I start to get a pretty good basic idea of the form and the structure. Because I can see that the way that you're doing the eyelids and then kind of building this form for the nostril is very much like how we discuss the modification of form and the buildup of form. And so that's a good sign because it shows that you have a nice comprehension for how we're thinking about building form and getting to these features. But I think what's holding it back is just the big stuff still. Right, so making sure that we get the drawing to a place first where the features and their addition will make sense to us. Right, and so the other thing would be, maybe this feels a little bit too kind of pushed in for the cheek. So I always want to try to match whatever I have here. If you can, just kind of animate it over in your head and try to do it exact same height, but kind of pulled over. Right, so that kind of just pulls across. And then the other thing here that starts to, I think, become a little counterproductive in terms of features is because this gets longer. So the thing that I'm noticing now is that the perspective of the features start to go more this way and then this way. So in that sense, you're almost bending the head, which is subtle, but it makes a difference because that would be like a piece of macaroni. Like we'd see something that's turning away from us if we look at the macaroni from the center. in two perspective directions. Like that starts to move this way, that starts to move back and down that way. So it's just kind of giving us too much conflicting information. One thing that helps me with that is when you start to drop your eye line and center line, try not to curve it. So as soon as I drop down that center line, it's going to come to the wrapping line and then it's straight. So no curvature down here. So it's just going to be straight, and that straight at that early stage is always going to match the tilt. But when I start to bow or bend, it's going to distort. It's going to make that plane of the face start to push. So we'll get subtle variations in like direction if you're worried about kind of matching that contour. That's with the addition of form. So like the addition of the tooth cylinder or the addition of the chin. But what I would want instead when we start to work into these features is the consistency of the wrapping lines to match the big perspective. Right? So you should notice in mind that like these lines here are always the same for each feature. That to this. And so I think that this is one I wanted to definitely cover because this is a really common stumbling block for myself and I think anybody else trying to do something complicated like the portrait, is we might be really good at seeing the detail of the feature and have a lot of success with how it's drawn, but sometimes that might not look the way we want it because the setup information or the information that's around the feature that's well drawn, it just needs a little tune-up or some more consistency with the perspective principles. So that's what I think would be best kind of addressed or looked at in this one, even though it's not so much feature specific. Again, the read of the features could really boil down to any number of prior steps that we've been through. The submissions were also really successful and nicely done. So now I think you're also getting pretty close to likeness also, right? The likeness is getting pretty near. So some things you could start to mix in now might just be, like trying to soften some areas, or I would say especially on parts that are turning away, what feels to me like it could use a little bit more help here is just the way that the profile is starting to read. So let's just take kind of this area and focus in there for this one. But you have a lot of things we talked about I could see you doing well. Like that's a nice form for thinking of that out and in, that ribbon shape. So that kind of leads back into this socket here. You have some nice perspective around the way you're thinking of the lids wrapping over the ball of the eye. Really nice perspectives around the nose. So one thing that could help here, right, if I'm trying to just look at this outside socket and then referencing our model. So let's just say that's the turn of the socket. Here's the nose coming forward. What I like that you did that I think is not obvious on this part I'm looking through is when you ended your nose, you have avoided what could be a really flat and kind of graphic thing that's happening over here where the nose and the cheek just kind of almost become tangent. And instead, it looks like you decided to push that a little bit lower to give us a clearer overlap. Really nicely done. So that's something that isn't what we see, but makes a better impact on the read of the drawing. I think you should be doing the same thing here too. So if I start to try to manage or look at some of the forms here, I feel like this part of your drawing flattens out because we have such a consistency, like it's almost tangent all the way through then the build of those features, where you seem to kind of manage it or miss it in other areas. So this is encouraging, right? Because you're clearly able to see it and understand it and avoid it. So it just takes a little bit of attention on this side. So we're going to draw that eye. The way I would try to do it is push some areas just like you did in the cheek and nose. We can still keep this nice soft turn and kind of smooth surfacing underneath the brow there. Then we could push the lid forward. And then sometimes I'll aim for that corner to be right where I see the lash. So if it's unclear, you could do that. But I would deliberately try to push some overlap from that to this. So that gives me a T. And then on this side, so we'd have the structure of the nose in the way. And that's nice because that can maybe overlap the eye some. Then for the lower lid, let's do the same. So we have the eye, the sphere of the eye, and then the lid in here. And let's push that out a little bit. Probably could thin the eye or kind of shrink the eye a bit as far as the shape. There would be the pupil or the iris as an ellipse. And then a little bit of that ledge let's say for the bottom of that lid, so this form comes round, out, or a round, out, and then back and down. And then a little bit of this kind of fallback of the fat or the skin under the eye behind the nose. Just like I'm building a really subtle landscape in there. That's the only thing that kind of stands out to me on that one. I do think maybe you could shrink the eyes just a little bit. Maybe this is getting a little bit big, or double check that. And then let's take a look at the lips too. This is why I started, or I wanted to bring some attention to the last review we did, which was some of the same things might be happening here just based on the perspective. So again, these start to pull this way as a overall perspective wrapping line. So once I'm comfortable with where I think the mouth is, right, that whole geometry of the denture sphere, then I want to look for the part of the lips as something that goes consistent with every other wrapping attachment for the rest of the face. So it could be brow or bottom of socket, but all of those lines, or these lines that we use as proportions, would need to have, or I think do a lot of service in the drawing by matching the overall perspective. So here, this is the side of the nose just for some continuity. So if we're going to build out now into the lips, here's the philtrum shape coming out. So that's nice. You have a nice design for that. And then you even gave like a nice detailing to the curvature of the upper lip in that center. And then this comes back. The only difference would be touch it to that. And you don't have to do it everywhere. This is especially true if there's like expressions. But I always try to grab it, make the lips touch this perspective wrap in the middle or somewhere along that surface. So the only change that would really need to happen is really subtle. You could just tweak it this way. You already have the underplane here, and then careful with this getting too much curved back. Again, same as the last review in terms of the issues that I would address that aren't, again, feature specific, but because that bottom part of the face starts to curve back a little bit, it does feel somewhat warped, or because the lips have a grab that, even though subtle, insinuates a different perspective than some of the other features, it can feel like it's maybe distorting off of the overall of the face. This one's almost, or that one's fine probably, because we get this, and that matches the fold across the form. You did a nice job overlapping that. Maybe I could push this overlap of the lower lip more, so that I make in this line, this to that, another T. So that's the upper lip going behind the lower lip. And then that could tie back and up to the point of connection. And then maybe, well, here you did a really great job on finding the plane change. So here's an instance, I think, of when your perspective of the individual parts are really successful, but the way that it sits on that denture sphere or the secondary part gets a little weaker. Here's that bottom plane, the divot space underneath the lip, and then we have, this is nice. I would play this up in your drawing more. That comes in front. So really strong. I thought all of the drawings in this submission were well done. Good realization and study of the different features for the individual perspectives. But again, a common misstep I get all the time where if I go a little bit too quickly, or if I just put my focus too much on the feature, and I don't work through my steps and really get everything to work and kind of double check, I can get my features to slide a little bit in the exact same way. It's an easy fix though. So next up, I think the big takeaway from this though would be that the one thing that's really important before moving into a closer study of your features is that you're grounding them in the structure or the head construction, and that they maintain that sense of perspective before you start to move into the specifics of the individual forms. So this is one where it's harder for me to find a lot of negative things or critical feedback to share. I just think it's really well done for the most part. If anything, maybe we could say that what's thematic to his head, there's like a really critical triple check here, is that he's leaning down and forward. So this would be kind of bringing it back to like the big fundamentals of what we did in our first 4 steps. And so now I might want to go to each feature and say, well, is that still taking place? Do I still have that as the big theme? So I think for the most part, yeah, but if we're really being super specific, maybe this nose needs to drop a little bit more. Or maybe that needs to come down just for where that turn is. And then like, how can I use this basic idea and still have my features, but not lose that reference to perspective? So maybe I could push that just slightly back up a bit more. I could still show you a slight underplane, but maybe this, keeps us in the land of that big perspective theme a bit more. And then maybe that also needs to stay consistent with the grouping of where that cartilage moves from here to here. And then maybe that's where I start to see the highlight. I think, though, this one, my advice or suggestion for a drawing at this stage would be, it's probably a good time now to go to tone, right? There's only so much, more investigation that we could do with line. There's only so many more planes and lines you could find. So it would be good to now see how would this translate into ideas of tone for you. Right? We talked about how, every line is just an opportunity to rethink edge. So maybe come back in and start to put some shading on top of this. And so that's the plane of the brow. What I'm trying to do with that line as my double check, and this is how I'd look at my own work, is to see how that relates to this, right? So trying to get these all to come back to the same perspective line. Or again, the idea that all the features need to reference that plane, just as much as they need to keep the overall perspective. So here's that eye. How am I overlapping this and wrapping it? Maybe these eyes, as he looks up, need to meet on a plane that's kind of indicative of the bottom of that socket area. And if that idea of shadow as it relates to the linear understructure is still a little vague, just notice, especially around cast shadows, how the cast shadow line is just dropping you really severely across different planes and their plane changes. And then now we start to kind of keep this study going. I'm mostly really happy with how this eye turned out, right? Because it is going to move independently of the structure in here. So it can look up while the structure looks down, said differently. So how would I kind of work through that and make sure it still just has the reference to the big? So maybe I just need some of those lines. And then I'm noticing that maybe the mouth has a slightly different angle. So this is the only place where maybe the drawing starts to get a little bit wobbly, is how all of these lines start to share a different direction. To maintain structure, I would want this all to agree. So the lips should go this way, right? Unless there's some kind of expression to the face where like the mouth is moving in a different direction. Here's the bottom portion, but all those planes are really nicely done. I wouldn't change anything about the way the planes are situated, like how nicely this philtrum to the top and bottom of the lip changes or looks. But you notice if we just start to kind of shift these back, that it starts to feel like the features inhabit that front plane a bit more securely. Let's do the same thing for the chin and then tweak this up. So now jaw, if I'm starting to think about, like, let's say I'm comfortable with the front plane of my face and I'm moving around to the side. Now all my side lines I would think about in reference to that. So what I like that's happening is the ear. So the ear has that placement on the side. You did a really nice kind of front plane, and it's just that perspective-based C, but that all feels like it sits on that. Like it's well grafted to that surface, we could say. Maybe that comes down here. Yeah, so that would be the big takeaways from this. And I think, again, something that, even though this one is really well done, is just like a nice triple check to see how the big features are still ordered to that initial construction. But if you're finding yourself at this stage, I think a good next step would be to move into the addition of light and shadow and starting to develop up those planes. It's going to be something that will help you understand this stage even more, quality or feature to add to your drawing practice, so that you develop both skills hand in hand, how line relates to tone, how tone relates to structure, and back and forth.